At its peak, the British Empire ruled over a quarter of the Earth's land and population, a global titan powered by red-coated soldiers, iron steamships, and ruthless ambition. But how did a small island nation off the coast of Europe come to control vast swathes of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and beyond? And how did it all unravel, leaving behind a complex legacy of innovation, oppression, resistance, and revolution? This is not just a story of battles and borders. It's a saga of bold explorers, cunning politicians, fierce independence movements, and ordinary people whose lives were changed forever by empire. From the smoke-filled rooms of London to the bloody fields of India, from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the opium wars in China, the British Empire shaped the modern world in ways we're still reckoning with today. But what began as a quest for trade and territory ended in global upheaval, wars for freedom, and a reckoning with centuries of domination. This is the full story, not just of rise and fall, but of power, pride, resistance, and consequence. Stay tuned as we uncover the truth behind the most influential empire in history. It all began with a simple ambition: profit. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, while Spain and Portugal carved out vast empires in the Americas, Britain was a relative backwater, fractured, poor, and still reeling from internal wars. But the sea held promises. Merchant adventurers, privateers, and explorers set their sights on distant lands. With the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, England began to challenge the established maritime powers. That victory wasn't just military. It marked the psychological beginning of England's imperial dream. The first real moves came not with armies, but with companies. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the East India Company, a private trading corporation with military powers. It would grow into one of the most powerful entities the world had ever seen, richer than kings, commanding private armies, and reshaping continents. Meanwhile, settlers landed in Jamestown in 1607, planting Britain's flag in North America. These early colonies were fragile, often failures, but they laid the foundation for an empire built not only on conquest, but commerce and colonization. The ideology followed the gold. British leaders began to speak of a civilizing mission, of spreading Christianity, English values, and order to so-called savage lands. But beneath that rhetoric lay raw extraction. Sugar, tobacco, spices, and eventually slaves flowed back to Britain. Profits soared. Whole cities like Liverpool and Bristol flourished on the back of colonial trade. And while British colonists settled the Americas, enslaved Africans were shipped across the Atlantic to fuel plantation economies. The empire's early success was lubricated by violence and by a willingness to commodify human life. Religion played a major role in these ventures. Protestant England viewed Catholic Spain and its empire as both competitors and moral failures. The British justified their own colonization through a mix of divine destiny and national pride. Religious sects, like the Puritans, sought refuge in the New World, where they planted communities that would become centers of British control. The idea of empire became sacred, an expression of divine favor, national superiority, and economic genius. By the end of the 17th century, the pieces were falling into place. Britain's navy was expanding. Its merchants were growing richer. Its colonies in the Caribbean, North America, and India were becoming entrenched. And critically, Britain had begun to see itself not just as a European nation, but as a global power. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't yet coined, but the foundation for that reality was solidly being laid. This was not an empire forged overnight, nor was it one that emerged without blood. It was built through a mixture of opportunism, ruthless capitalism, spiritual justification, and raw geopolitical ambition. The small island nation had cast its net wide, and the world would never be the same. But to understand how a scrappy nation of pirates and traders transformed into an empire, we have to look at the figures behind the scenes. Men like Sir Francis Drake, who circumnavigated the globe and raided Spanish ports, were hailed as national heroes, even as they acted little better than sanctioned pirates. Explorers like James Cook mapped the Pacific, claiming vast new territories. Their voyages were backed not just by curiosity, but by cold, calculated empire building. In Ireland, England tested its first experiments in colonization. Brutal campaigns and land seizures became templates for imperial policy elsewhere. Irish Catholics were dispossessed and replaced by loyal Protestant settlers. This plantation model would later be used in the Americas and the Caribbean, where enslaved labor replaced native populations. Meanwhile, in Africa, British forts sprang up along the Gold Coast, today's Ghana, not for exploration, but to dominate the slave trade. British ships carried goods to Africa, traded for captives, transported them across the Atlantic, and returned home with sugar, cotton, and tobacco. This was the notorious triangular trade, and it turned British ports into economic powerhouses. The role of the monarchy and parliament also evolved. Kings and queens sponsored exploration and conquest, but so did private investors. The British Empire was unique in that it wasn't just a state-run project. It was a capitalist enterprise. Wealthy shareholders backed risky ventures, hoping for massive returns. Colonies weren't just symbols of power, they were investments, and every rebellion or disruption threatened profit. And while Britain expanded abroad, it consolidated power at home. The 1707 Act of Union united England and Scotland, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. This union merged economic and military strength, accelerating imperial ambitions. Scottish merchants and soldiers soon became crucial players in building and policing the empire. By the 18th century, British ships dominated the seas. Its influence stretched from Canada to the Caribbean, from the West African coast to the ports of Bengal. London became the beating heart of an expanding network of commerce, conflict, and control. The British were no longer just competing with other European powers, they were surpassing them. But as they built this vast imperial machine, they also laid the groundwork for future resistance. Every inch of conquest came with consequences. In the shadows of prosperity, resentment simmered. The rise of the British Empire was breathtaking in speed, ambition, and reach. But what looked like triumph from London often felt like tragedy elsewhere. For every fortune made, lives were disrupted. For every flag planted, cultures were uprooted. This was only the beginning. If the British Empire had a beating heart, it wasn't the monarchy, it was the East India Company. Born in a London tavern in 1600 with a royal charter and a vague promise of trade, the company would grow into a corporate monster. It wasn't just a business, it was an empire in its own right, with its own flag, its own armies, and its own laws. At its peak, it controlled more than 300 million people, nearly a fifth of the world's population, and accounted for half of global trade. This was capitalism weaponized. The company's original mission was straightforward: break the Portuguese and Dutch monopoly on the spice trade. But the ambitions quickly escalated. Silk, tea, cotton, and opium joined the list of exports. British ships carried these goods from Indian ports to the global market, making London the financial capital of the world. Indian weavers, once the finest artisans on earth, were reduced to cheap labor or put out of business entirely as British textiles flooded their markets. The company wasn't there to develop India, it was there to drain it. What made the East India Company so terrifying wasn't just its size, it was its absolute lack of accountability. Governed by a board of directors in London and led by men like Robert Clive in the field, it operated as both merchant and military. It forged alliances, bribed kings, toppled rulers, and installed puppet governments. In 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, the company seized Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India. This wasn't conquest by crown. It was conquest by shareholders. The consequences were catastrophic. Under company rule, famines became routine. In 1770, a famine in Bengal killed an estimated 10 million people, 1/3 of the population. Food was available, but hoarded or exported for profit. The company's only concern was revenue. Taxes were brutally collected. Traditional agriculture was replaced with cash crops like indigo and opium. India was being systematically hollowed out to feed British appetites and fuel imperial ambitions. Opium became one of the most profitable weapons in the company's arsenal. When China resisted British opium imports, the British responded with force. The opium wars of the 19th century weren't just drug conflicts. They were about power, profit, and humiliation. The British forced open Chinese ports, seized Hong Kong, and demanded vast reparations. All of it, the addiction, the warfare, the diplomacy, was rooted in the company's drive to sell more drugs. The East India Company also helped perfect a model of racial and administrative control that would be exported across the empire. British officers lived in walled compounds, separate from the local population. A hierarchy of race and class was enforced. White ruled over brown, British ruled over native. Indian soldiers or sepoys were recruited to enforce British rule, but always reminded of their subordination. The lines of division were drawn deep, but even empires powered by gold and gunpowder are not invincible. By the early 19th century, the company's greed and mismanagement had become impossible to ignore, even in London. Corruption scandals exploded. Critics in Parliament called it a state within a state. And then, in 1857, the powder keg ignited. Indian sepoys, furious over religious insensitivity, abuse, and injustice, rose in rebellion. What began as a mutiny turned into a full-scale war. Cities burned. Massacres took place on both sides. The British responded with overwhelming violence. The rebellion failed, but it changed everything. In its aftermath, the British Crown dissolved the East India Company. India would now be ruled directly by the British government. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. The company was dead, but its legacy and its model of ruthless economic imperialism would live on. The East India Company wasn't just a footnote in the story of empire. It was the empire. Its reach, its methods, and its profits defined the way Britain operated around the globe. It showed how far a nation would go, not for land or glory, but for money. It taught Britain that trade could conquer where armies failed, and that control of markets was the key to global power. The company was the engine, and the empire was its machine. Trade may have laid the foundations of the British Empire, but it was war that expanded its walls. As the empire grew, it became increasingly clear that diplomacy and commerce weren't enough. If Britain was to dominate the globe, it had to fight for it. And it did, relentlessly. In every corner of the world, from dusty deserts to frozen frontiers, red-coated soldiers marched under the Union Jack, enforcing imperial will with rifles, cannons, and cold efficiency. The 18th century saw Britain entangled in nearly non-stop conflict, especially with its greatest rival, France. The two powers battled across continents in what historians now call the Second Hundred Years' War. North America became a primary battleground during the 7 Years' War. In 1759, the British captured Quebec, marking the beginning of the end for French influence in Canada. By the war's conclusion in 1763, Britain had taken vast territories in India, North America, and the Caribbean. This was not just victory, it was global dominance, but conquest brought complications. In 1776, the American colonies declared independence. For the first time, Britain's imperial machine stumbled and lost. The American Revolution shocked the British elite. A colony had rebelled and won. But rather than restrain expansion, this loss only fueled a new hunger. Attention shifted toward Asia and Africa, where opposition could be more easily crushed and resources more thoroughly extracted. The 19th century became a golden age of imperial warfare. In Africa, British forces waged brutal campaigns against local kingdoms. In Sudan, General Gordon's death at Khartoum became a rallying cry, leading to a vengeful campaign that left entire cities in ruins. In southern Africa, the British fought the Zulu kingdom, defeating one of the most formidable indigenous armies in history at Rorke's Drift. The Anglo-Zulu War showcased both the limits and lethality of British military might. Meanwhile, the British turned their sights on the Boer republics, descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa. These white farmers had their own ambitions, and they didn't want British interference. What followed were the Boer Wars, especially the Second War from 1899 to 1902, a bloody, drawn-out conflict that tested Britain's endurance. The British used scorched earth tactics, burned farms, and herded civilians into concentration camps, a term that would gain horrifying new meaning in the 20th century. Elsewhere, conquest came with calculated precision. In Burma, Malaya, Egypt, and parts of the Middle East, Britain employed a combination of force and political manipulation. Sometimes the flag followed the merchant ship. Other times, the merchant ship followed the bayonet. Treaties were signed under duress. Rebellions were crushed before they could spread. In every case, the goal was the same: control resources, secure trade routes, and prevent rivals from gaining ground. Military conquest also fueled Britain's image at home. Victories were celebrated in newspapers, taught in schools, and commemorated in statues and street names. The empire was presented as noble, even romantic, a force bringing light to dark places. But behind that propaganda lay thousands of dead and displaced. Indigenous resistance movements like the Maori in New Zealand or the Afghans in the Hindu Kush fought valiantly, but were eventually overwhelmed by British firepower. And yet, with every war, cracks deepened. Soldiers grew weary. Taxpayers began to question the costs. And across the empire, resistance didn't die. It evolved. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and nationalist movements took root. The sword had won many battles, but it could not kill the dream of independence. As the 20th century approached, the British Empire had become the largest the world had ever seen, but it had earned that title through fire, blood, and conquest, and the fires it had ignited were not easily extinguished. India wasn't just another colony, it was the colony, the crown jewel of the British Empire. With its vast population, abundant natural resources, and deep cultural heritage, India was the empire's greatest prize. But controlling a subcontinent was no easy feat. British rule in India was built on a careful balance of divide-and-conquer politics, brutal suppression, and elaborate shows of power. It was a delicate illusion, one that would eventually shatter. After the East India Company's brutal collapse, the British Crown took direct control of India in 1858. Queen Victoria was crowned Empress of India, and a new era of imperial administration began. The British Raj, meaning rule, was established. A sprawling bureaucracy governed hundreds of millions, enforcing policies that prioritized British interests at every level. Indian voices were excluded from meaningful power. Railways were built not for the people, but to extract resources faster. The infrastructure served the colonizer, not the colonized. Culturally, the British viewed India with fascination and disdain. They admired ancient monuments and collected Sanskrit texts, but dismissed Indian religions, customs, and governance as inferior. Racism wasn't just a side effect, it was central to the imperial ideology. British officials lived in isolated enclaves, attended exclusive clubs, and considered themselves racially and morally superior. The Indian civil service, often called the steel frame of the empire, was almost entirely white. But India was never passive. Resistance simmered constantly. In 1857, just before the Raj began, the Sepoy Rebellion shook British confidence. Indian soldiers mutinied against British officers, outraged over religious insensitivity and deep-seated grievances. Though the uprising was crushed, it planted the seeds of modern nationalism. Over the following decades, a new class of educated Indians emerged. Lawyers, writers, and reformers who began to challenge colonial authority, not with muskets, but with arguments. Figures like Dadabhai Naoroji, the first Indian MP in British Parliament, exposed the drain of wealth from India to Britain. Others, like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, demanded Swaraj, self-rule. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, began as a forum for moderate reform, but would eventually become the spearhead of independence. The British responded with repression, arrests, censorship, and crackdowns. But the fire had been lit. Economically, India paid dearly for its status as jewel. British industrial policy destroyed Indian textile industries, turning a once thriving economy into a source of raw cotton for Lancashire mills. Famines continued, worsened by export policies that prioritized profit over people. In some regions, the death tolls were staggering. Millions perished, and the British response was often slow and indifferent, sometimes even blaming Indians for their own starvation. Despite this, the British portrayed their rule as a gift, bringing law, railways, education, and order. But the Indian people saw the truth. They were being ruled, not served. And by the early 20th century, a new leader would rise who would transform resistance into revolution, not with guns, but with truth. That leader was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. By the early 20th century, the British Empire appeared invincible. It spanned continents, controlled oceans, and boasted unmatched economic might. But beneath the polished veneer of power, cracks were forming. From India to Ireland, from Kenya to the Caribbean, resistance movements were gaining strength. The empire's subjects had watched, endured, and waited, and now they were pushing back. In India, the return of Gandhi marked a new phase in anti-colonial struggle. His approach, nonviolent resistance, was revolutionary. Instead of meeting force with force, Gandhi led massive boycotts, civil disobedience campaigns, and salt marches. He exposed the moral hypocrisy of British rule, the so-called champions of freedom denying it to millions. The British arrested him, beat protesters, and tried to maintain control. But every act of repression only swelled the ranks of resistance. Meanwhile, in Ireland, British control faced another existential threat. The Easter Rising of 1916 and the brutal suppression that followed ignited a firestorm. By 1921, Ireland was partitioned and the Irish Free State was born, a humiliating blow to British pride. The empire, for the first time in modern memory, had lost part of its home islands. This was no longer just foreign unrest. It was a fracture in the imperial core. In Africa, resistance wore different faces. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising emerged from decades of land dispossession and racial apartheid. The British response was savage: mass internment, torture, executions. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah galvanized a generation, demanding freedom not in whispers, but on stages and in rallies. Across the continent, British colonial officials were losing their grip, not just militarily, but ideologically. The very people they claimed to civilize were demanding their independence. The Caribbean too stirred with rebellion. Workers in Jamaica and Trinidad launched strikes against brutal labor conditions and colonial neglect. The British crushed them with police batons and prison cells. But again, each crackdown revealed the brittleness of empire. The subjects were no longer silent. The myths were fading. The authority was cracking. Even within Britain, opposition grew. Politicians and intellectuals began to question the morality and sustainability of empire. Figures like George Orwell, who served in colonial Burma, criticized the system as inherently corrupt. Economic arguments no longer justified the cost of maintaining overseas control. The Second World War would only accelerate this unraveling. The empire, once held together by force and fear, was now challenged by courage, conviction, and clarity. Around the world, colonized peoples were no longer pleading. They were demanding. The age of passive subjugation was ending, and the British crown was running out of places to hide its cracks. The First World War marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire, even if no one realized it at the time. When the war broke out in 1914, Britain turned to its empire for manpower and resources. Over 2 million Indian soldiers served in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Caribbean also answered the call. They fought and died for a crown that often didn't see them as equals. And yet, when the guns finally fell silent, the empire acted as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The war had cracked the illusion of imperial invincibility. Colonized peoples saw Britain's vulnerability and began to ask, if we can fight and bleed for you, why can't we govern ourselves? Meanwhile, back in London, the costs of empire were mounting. The war had left Britain in massive debt. Entire cities needed rebuilding. The economy was strained. Maintaining global control was becoming a burden, not a benefit. The interwar period offered no peace. In India, Gandhi launched the non-cooperation movement, urging millions to withdraw from British institutions. In Egypt, nationalist riots erupted. In Ireland, civil war followed partition. The empire was being pulled apart not by foreign enemies, but by the very people it claimed to rule. Then came the Second World War, and with it, the fatal blow. Once again, Britain leaned heavily on its colonies. Indian troops fought the Nazis in North Africa and the Japanese in Burma. African regiments served in brutal campaigns. But this time, the empire's contradictions were impossible to ignore. Britain was preaching freedom while ruling over half the world. The hypocrisy was glaring, especially as American and Soviet leaders demanded a new post-war order based on self-determination. By 1945, the British Empire was exhausted. London had survived the Blitz, but its economy was shattered. Its prestige was tarnished. It had won the war, but lost its grip. The United States had replaced it as the global superpower, and Washington had little interest in preserving old colonial empires. At the same time, anti-colonial movements around the world had grown bolder, more organized, and more determined. India became the tipping point. In 1947, after years of civil disobedience, negotiations, and mounting unrest, Britain agreed to grant independence. But the withdrawal was rushed and chaotic. Partition carved India into two, India and Pakistan, sparking mass violence, ethnic cleansing, and the deaths of up to 2 million people. The empire's jewel had shattered, and it bled. Other colonies watched closely. If India could break free, why not Kenya? Why not Ghana? Why not Malaya? The British Empire had survived 2 world wars, but it wouldn't survive the peace that followed. The post-war years were a whirlwind. What had taken centuries to build, the most powerful empire the world had ever known, was dismantled in just a few decades. Between 1947 and the late 1970s, dozens of British colonies declared independence. Some transitions were peaceful, others were soaked in blood. Either way, the empire was dying, and the British government could no longer pretend otherwise. Africa became the epicenter of decolonization. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah led a non-violent movement that culminated in independence in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from British rule. The dominoes fell fast. Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and others followed. Some, like Tanzania, transitioned relatively peacefully. Others, like Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, witnessed horrific violence. British forces detained and tortured thousands. Villages were burned. Entire populations were surveilled. The cost of control had become both moral and financial, and it was no longer sustainable. In Asia, the story repeated. Burma, now Myanmar, and Sri Lanka gained independence. In Malaya, the British fought a prolonged guerrilla war before eventually conceding. Hong Kong remained, but even it was handed back to China in 1997, symbolizing the empire's final retreat from Asia. The myth of British supremacy had been shattered, not by an enemy invasion, but by the will of the people it once ruled. The Caribbean, too, saw waves of independence. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados and others left the empire and became sovereign nations. But even as flags changed and constitutions were written, the economic legacy of colonialism lingered. Former colonies often found themselves tethered to Britain through trade, language, and financial dependency. Political freedom had arrived, but true independence was a much harder road. Back in Britain, public opinion shifted. The empire that had once been a source of pride became a source of unease. Immigration from former colonies sparked fierce debates. The arrival of the Windrush generation from the Caribbean and later waves from South Asia and Africa transformed Britain's cities and ignited tensions. As the empire dissolved abroad, its legacy came home. By the 1980s, the British Empire had all but disappeared, replaced by the Commonwealth, a loose association of former colonies. But the transition was not without irony. Many of these nations still bore the marks of British rule: parliamentary systems, legal codes, even the English language. The sun had set, but its shadow remained long. In the final reckoning, decolonization wasn't just the end of British rule. It was a global realignment. New nations were born, old powers fell, and the world once organized by imperial hierarchies became a patchwork of sovereignties, struggles, and unfinished stories. The British Empire had collapsed, but its consequences were only beginning. The British Empire no longer exists, at least not on maps, but its fingerprints are everywhere, in legal systems, in languages, in city names and school uniforms, in cricket stadiums in India, road signs in Kenya, and parliaments in the Caribbean. The empire may have collapsed, but its legacy continues to shape the modern world in ways both visible and invisible. Some argue that Britain left behind positive contributions: infrastructure, education systems, democratic institutions. But for every railway built, there's a famine worsened by colonial policy. For every university founded, a language or tradition was erased. The empire's gifts were often tools of control, not empowerment. They served the rulers, not the ruled. Across former colonies, the impact of empire is still unfolding. In Africa and Asia, arbitrary borders drawn by imperial cartographers continue to spark conflict. Economies remain shaped by colonial extraction patterns, exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. In some countries, authoritarian regimes rose in the vacuum left by British rule. In others, class systems rooted in colonial hierarchies persist. Even within Britain, the reckoning has only just begun. Statues of imperial figures like Cecil Rhodes and Edward Colston have been defaced, toppled, or debated. Museums are under pressure to return looted artifacts. Schools are being urged to teach colonial history not as glory, but as complexity. The conversation has shifted from nostalgia to accountability. The Commonwealth, often cited as a legacy of unity, is more symbolic than substantial. While some countries value the connection, others see it as a relic, a reminder of subjugation wrapped in polite diplomacy. Britain's place in the world is no longer imperial, but post-imperial, a nation still haunted by its past, yet struggling to define its future. And yet history resists simple judgments. The empire was not one thing. It was a machine of trade, a force of violence, a system of governance, and a cultural juggernaut. It created global networks, but also global trauma. It sparked revolutions, but also technological revolutions. It brought people together and tore them apart. The British Empire is gone, but the world it made is still with us. Every headline about global inequality, every debate over reparations, every act of remembrance or resistance, they echo back to centuries of imperial rule. The question now is not whether the empire mattered. The question is, what do we do with what it left behind?